collaborate with some of the other exchanges. I was mentioning that we have a meeting with that's co-sponsored with the Pennsylvania Prescribed Fire Council, excuse me, and also with a consortium of Appalachian fire managers and scientists coming up in February on communication about prescribed fire in the East. And then also today we are featuring Zander Evans, who's involved with the Southwest Fire Science Consortium. In our region, which we consider carrying into Canada, we have many partners up there. We have some unique needs, as many of you are quite familiar with. We have very high population densities, and we have very diverse land ownership groups, and our management units are different from what you might find out west. But fire is definitely very much a part of our landscape here in the North Atlantic. We try to catalyze collaborations, mostly through and communications. And we do a lot of that in fire science and management through our research briefs, our newsletters, our webinars like today. We have a research database, and we have field trips, and we also hold capstone workshops. And all of the information for all of these events and items can be found on our website, firesciencenorthatlantic.org. But we have a great time bringing people together, especially in the field, to talk about fire science and management on topics that are relevant to our region. This is our leadership team, Nick Skoronsky, Aaron Lane, myself, and Dr. Engel Lapuma. And we're excited to get to work together representing different agencies and organizations to try to deliver good fire science and management to folks in the North Atlantic region. We're not alone. We have great community representatives, and if you look through the list of folks that we have here, we're really proud to have a really great group of folks representing a diversity of agencies, academics, private consulting, and other organizations that really keep us real and help us know what are the needs of folks in our region for fire science and management delivery. So without further ado, that's me. Zander, you want to take the floor back?
Sure.
Okay, so time for me to introduce our speaker for today. So the topic for today, community wildfire protection plans that are developed by an engaged community can drive real wildfire mitigation in the wildland-urban interface, or WUI, as we commonly call it. So today, Dr. Zander Evans is going to outline some of the key elements of successful CWPPs, some research that's been conducted in New Mexico, but is applicable to the North Atlantic. And there are examples, a couple of examples that he'll cite from New Jersey and from Cape Cod. So Dr. Zander Evans is the research director at the Forest Stewards Guild. The Guild's mission is to promote ecologically, economically, and socially responsible forestry as a means of sustaining the integrity of forest ecosystems and the human communities dependent upon them. So CWPPs fits right into that. Zander directs and conducts research published in numerous peer-reviewed journals and management-oriented reports to support on-the-ground implementation of ecological forestry. A lot of those reports can be found on the Forest Stewards Guild website as well. His current research includes the effectiveness of fuel treatments and the sustainability of forest bioenergy, and really anything else that is really of interest and a current issue in forest stewardship. Zander is involved in local collaborative efforts to improve forest management as a board member on the Southwest Fire Science Consortium. He received his PhD from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies after working as a cartographer and spatial analyst with the U.S. Geological Survey. So he is no stranger to the Northeast. And Zander, thank you so much for joining us to present today's webinar.
Thank you, Amanda. And I'll dive right in. I want to leave a lot of time for questions. So what I'm going to be talking about today is drawn from a report we did that we published last October. Gosh, that's almost a year ago now. Seems so much more recent. And so if there are issues or questions you have and you want more detail, please do dig into the report. There's also a summary which brings out the highlights from the report. Both of these, both the full document and the summary document, are available on the Guild webpage or the Joint Fire Sciences Program webpage. And as Amanda mentioned, we're going to dive into the wildland-urban interface, the WUI. So much of the population in the United States lives in the WUI. Something like a third of the U.S. lives in the WUI. And as we think about the Northeast, the North Atlantic, where this particular consortium is focused, obviously that percentage is a lot higher. In a place like Connecticut, 2/3, 66% of the population is in the WUI. So although when we think about the wild-land-urban interface or wildfire, at least sort of at a national level, people often have a picture of forests out west, but of course those of you in the Northeast know that that's hardly the only game in town. So the context, in addition to this widespread WUI across the country, the context for a lot of this conversation includes rising suppression costs. So this is the cost mainly to the Forest Service for suppressing wildfires throughout the country. And the average cost of this continues to increase. It varies year to year. This year it'll probably be a little bit lower than past years, but it continues on average to rise over time, dramatically affecting the Forest Service budget in a really negative way. The losses due to wildfire, these are insured losses. Again, they vary year to year, but there is a sort of rising average. And one thing I like to point out with this particular graph is the disconnect between the number of acres burned and the wildfire losses due to insurance. So these two peaks, I believe it's 2003 and 2007, they're not necessarily the years where the most acres burned, but in fact they're the years when Southern California burned. So I highlight this in a North Atlantic context because even though we may not have seen a lot of insured losses from wildfire in the North Atlantic region to date, obviously there have been some, but maybe not on the scale of Southern California, because of the tight interface between wildlands and development in the Northeast, there is an opportunity, or a threat, I should say, of real impacts to homeowners and populations. The other context is the structure loss. So as we look over time, the number of structures lost is increasing. Again, changes year to year, but on average, this is increasing. So as we put all these together, they just provide this picture of threat from wildfires to people and infrastructure in the WUI. And I put this picture up to remind me to mention that it's not really about the fire. So we look at the left hand of this slide that was taken by Inga, I believe, and the fire isn't necessarily the problem. It's really the juxtaposition of the fire with the values, like the home or some sort of residence off to the right. And so the proximity of these two is where we really get problems. And obviously there are other values at risk, whether it's wildlife habitat or surface water supplies, those sorts of things. So it's not necessarily the fire itself that we're worried about, but this interplay between the fire and the values. So what do we do about this? Well, one thing that we build into our wildfire response is fuel reduction treatments. And this is, again, a shot from the Northeast, someone out doing a prescribed burn to reduce the amount of fuel available to burn in wildfire conditions. And obviously there are a lot of different kinds of fuel treatments. We can go in and cut, we can burn, we can remove timber, we can remove biomass, all sorts of things. And when we build these treatments based on science and plan them out according to what we've seen work in the past, they're very effective. And I put this slide up, this is a smattering of some of the research reports that are out there that just show this works. And many of these are focused on western coniferous forests, but I think there's sufficient research even in the North Atlantic systems, North Atlantic ecosystems, to demonstrate that fuel reduction treatments work. And we don't even have to just take the word of the researchers on this, but there are numerous examples now where large high-severity fires have burned into treatments. This is one from the wildfire, and the high-severity crown fire was burning down in the direction of that arrow down the mountain, and it burned into this area in here where there had been a treatment, and then firefighters were able to essentially stop it before it got to this WUI zone down at the bottom of the image. So this is just one example. There are numerous examples where we know that fuel treatments have worked, have made a difference on the ground. The other element of our wildfire response is often home mitigation. So reducing the risk that a home will ignite, reducing the probability that a home will ignite. And there's a lot of fairly standard actions that people can take to reduce the risk around their home. And these, again, are based not just on sort of guess about what's going to work, but on very scientific studies of how homes have burned in the past, when wildfires have come through a community, which homes have burned, and why. And taking these steps won't ensure that your home will never burn, but just like taking care of your own personal health, you can increase the probability that you'll have a long life, and you can increase the probability that your home will survive a wildfire based on a lot of good research by organizations like the National Institute for Standards and Technology. We bring all these two elements together into wildfire community protection plans, or community wildfire protection plans. I think I said that backwards. So these CWPPs are really an umbrella for both the fuel reduction treatments and the home mitigation efforts. One of the reasons for that is in the law that kicked off community wildfire protection plans, those were two of the three elements. The third element, actually it's the first element on this list, was the idea that they should be developed collaboratively. So this enshrined within community wildfire protection plans a collaborative approach, as well as focus both on the woods side, the forest side, as well as the home side, the structure side. So we balance those two things as we think about community wildfire protection plans. And there are a lot of community wildfire protection plans out there. There, as of this graph, I think there were something like 16,000, but there are many more now. And Amanda and I were looking at this graph the other day, and we realized that although the Northeast is a fairly slim slice of the overall number of CWPPs across the country, the growth from 2012 to 13 looks like it may have actually doubled. And so this is something we're going to see more of in the North Atlantic region, and it pays to try to do them right. We want to try to make plans that are effective and efficient. So along those lines, we asked in this research, are these plans working? And so that's really the point of this guide that we created. We tried to figure out a way to look at wildfire mitigation in general, both on the forest side and on the home side, and say, are all these dollars that we've invested, are they having an impact? So to do that, we focused in on New Mexico, and we chose a couple of community wildfire protection plans. They're kind of highlighted here on the screen. And for those of you who don't know New Mexico, it covers a lot of the populated areas. There are some different sizes. Some, like Cibola County or McKinley County, are county-wide CWPPs. Some, like Cuba, are smaller areas. There's also an East Mountain CWPP that's a smaller area. So we tried to balance because CWPPs can be of a range of sizes. And as we drilled down into these plans, one of the first things we did was to look at fuel treatments. You're not supposed to be able to read this map necessarily, but it's just a graphic for me to explain that. We looked at where all the treatments, so each of these different colors on the landscape is a different kind of treatment around Ruidoso, New Mexico. And we took these treatments and said, well, this is one aspect of the CWPP. They might not have all been planned or driven by the CWPP, but they come under that umbrella. And so let's look at how fires might have burned differently with and without these treatments. And obviously, we're not going to go out and light wildfires, so we did this in a modeling context. We went in and said, okay, let's imagine what would happen in computer modeling scenarios if we had fires start in these locations. And there's a whole sort of backstory on the specifics of the modeling that I'll leave out for now, but please do refer to the full report if you're interested. But in sum, there were some changes. Maybe not the impacts that we might dream of, but I'll call attention to one key difference that we noticed as we summarized the way fire was modeled to spread and burn through these test regions across 12 different WUI areas. So when we look at surface fire, these are small, probably most of you know, but just for review, these are small flames burning across the surface of the ground. Generally much easier to fight than something like an active crown fire on the other end of the spectrum, where the fire is burning through the crowns of trees and really requires an indirect approach for firefighting. Firefighters would have to pull back and wouldn't be able to go in and actually directly attack a fire that's burning that hot. So it's the active crown fires that we're really concerned about in terms of loss of life or property, although obviously both surface and passive crown fire can cause problems. So when we did this modeling, we looked at the pre-treatment, which is the left side of the screen, and then the post-treatment is here on the right side of the screen. So when we key in on the active crown fire, we see that pre-treatment, we have a significant percentage of the modeled fire in these areas, in these WUI areas, would be an active crown fire. After treatment, that drops to almost zero. There's still a few examples in the modeling as we model out all these different possibilities. A few of them include some active crown fire, but very few. And the key is that although there's still some passive crown fire, and in fact the passive crown fire increases because essentially you've moved from active crown fire to passive crown fire in the post-treatment scenarios, but that is a little more amenable to being able to engage firefighting resources. And so one of the things we've seen where wildfires affected or impacted existing fuel treatments is not necessarily the fuel treatments stop the fire, but it gives firefighters a place where they can actually attack the fire, a sort of ground to stand on. And so that could be the key difference here between pre and post treatment. And these again are based on real treatments on the ground and then brought into a modeling context. The next piece of our research was looking at home assessments. So we did that modeling work to look at the effectiveness of fuel treatments on the ground, and then we said, well, what's the other sort of side of the coin here? And that's home assessments. So these are going out and looking at real properties and whether they're, like in this picture on the left here, have trees hanging over propane tanks, wood stacked right around the propane tanks, really kind of a messy situation, a dangerous situation for firefighters. Or this on the right is actually after some work had been done, but it's an example where you might say, okay, that's a more reasonable, safer situation for firefighters and less likely to lose a home. So we went out and did these home assessments based on the assessment that the Santa Fe County Fire Department uses. And there are a lot of these different wildfire hazard assessments out there. They're often adapted to local conditions. A lot of them are based on a particular sort of a template, and then different communities say, oh, this is an important piece for our ecosystem or our community, we want to add that in. And so I can share this example. I believe it's actually in the guide, but there are lots of examples out there. And so we took this out into the field, and one of the unique things about our home assessments is not only did we look at 2,000 home assessments across New Mexico, but as I'll talk about in a minute, many of those we went back and reassessed. So one of the tricks about home assessments, and it's worth considering for those of you who might build home assessments into part of your future wildfire prevention work or CWPP work, is there isn't an absolute connection between the risk score from the home assessment and the likelihood that a home will be lost in a wildfire. There's good science that drives why different elements appear on the risk assessment, what makes them risky for a home, but it's hard to say that having a wood pile next to your home increases the risk of your home burning by 3% or 4% or 20%. And so we try to give scores to something like having a propane tank or a wood pile right next to your home, but those scores aren't exact. So we have to kind of take it in this relative sense. And in general, on average, we saw scores of 53 out of 150, and we could use that relative score to rank different communities and kind of see which communities had higher or lower scores within the different CWPPs. One of the things that was interesting to me in looking at these scores, obviously in New Mexico where we did this work, we've had a lot of wildfires. A lot of homes have been lost to wildfire, and yet 2/3 of the homes we assessed lack some really key elements of defensible space. Homes, conifers within 30 feet of homes, highly flammable ground cover within 3 feet of the home. So really kind of fundamental things that you would think more people would have clued into and changed around their home, but still 2/3 of homes lacked these elements of defensible space. Similarly, 20%, 22% of the average home hazard consisted of attributes that were difficult or expensive to change. So these would be attributes like the slope of the property, very difficult to change. Even things like the material the roof is made out of. It's expensive to re-roof your home, and so we consider that a difficult to change element. And so a fair portion of the risk of any home is kind of baked in. When you buy a home, you buy a home on a particular slope with a particular roofing material, with a particular distance from the road, those sorts of things that you're probably not going to be able to change. On the other hand, almost the same amount, 17% of the hazard, was made up of elements that are really easy to change. Things like where your firewood is stacked. Well, you're probably stacking your firewood every year, so the following year maybe you can just stack it in a different spot. That's a pretty easy to change risk reduction. Posting your street address at the edge of the road so the emergency responders can see it. Making sure your driveway is clear. There's some things that are relatively easy to do that can significantly change the risk of losing a home. So we tried to break that out, and it was interesting to see that within the assessments. So when we went in and did some reassessments, one of the interesting things that came up, and again, this is useful for people thinking about building home assessments into their wildfire prevention work, we found that there was a fair amount of discrepancy between the first assessment and the second assessment. Even things that shouldn't change, like the assessor's opinion of the slope of the property, showed up as different in some cases. And so that was concerning because that indicates that we're not always getting a good, clear assessment of the risk. There's some sort of opinion or objective noise in the data that's coming back. And so that suggested to us that although home assessments have an important role in wildfire risk reduction, there are things we can do to improve them. And so in the report, there's some data on when we went between the first assessment and the second assessment, what changes had been made, and trying to connect those with what else was going on in the community. Did communities that had CWPPs, active fire safe councils, that sort of thing, have more rapid change than others? And the data on that was a little bit noisy, in part because of this difference between assessments. Now, another piece of protecting homes is the FireWise program. This is a nationwide program, probably many of you are aware of. There are a number of FireWise communities in the Northeast that really focuses on bringing neighbors together across relatively small areas to reduce the risk of wildfire in their communities. Whether it's going out in sort of common areas and doing some thinning, or doing the kind of home mitigations we were just talking about. So here's just an example of a FireWise thinning where they maintained the forested character around their homes but took out some of the risk, some of the fuel. And so we interviewed people involved in FireWise communities, sort of the community coordinator for FireWise communities across New Mexico, to get a sense of what they thought of the FireWise program, how it was working for them, and to get some sense of how they got started, what other communities might be able to do to bring FireWise to their community. And based on our interviews, we got the almost unanimous report back that people really value the FireWise organization, and they really saw FireWise, the organization of FireWise, as a partner in their efforts to reduce the risk of wildfire in their communities. They valued the educational resources and also the reputation of this outside organization coming in and saying, yes, this is the right thing to do. I mean, a lot of these community coordinators are just regular folks in the community, and so having sort of the backup of, it's not just me saying this entire FireWise organization is out there. That was really a key benefit of being engaged in FireWise. We found that communities with a CWPP in place, or otherwise other nearby FireWise communities, had a much easier time getting FireWise recognition. And we found that one person can really be the spark that catalyzes a whole community to become FireWise. And one of the interesting things we saw was this ripple effect where one person might get a FireWise community started in their neighborhood, and then other people, in a community distant would hear about that and make that connection, and they would become FireWise. And so just one individual could have this ripple effect across a whole area, a whole region. And so that was pretty neat to see. Of course, the risk there is, the dark side of that is that if that individual gets tired of doing it, moves away, or something like that, you have the possibility that you can lose momentum. And so that's something that we really need to be aware of, where we see these great FireWise communities making a difference. What's the kind of succession plan, or does that coordinator have support? Are we making sure that it's all not just falling on one person's shoulders? So the last part of our study was to try to tie all this together, all these different elements, by assessing the overall CWPP. And some of the things we studied fit right in. But for example, FireWise often is mentioned in the CWPP, but it's not necessarily, it's certainly not a requirement for having a CWPP. So there's not a one-to-one connection. But we try to build this overall look at CWPPs. And what we pulled out are a couple of key points, and I'll talk these through. If you're interested in the case studies themselves, please do again refer to the guide, because there's a lot of good information if you're working on your own, if you're revising your own. So the first one, people are the key. Really engaging individuals, whether it's community members, state agencies, town, county, environmentalists, hunters, whoever, whatever groups you want to name, you have to engage people and really focus on their thoughts and not just the sort of broad brush, what you think people may get out of wildfire mitigation. Along those same lines, planning processes that are inclusive and build trust are really linked to successful outcomes. So to be blunt, we saw a couple of examples where counties or communities hired an outside consultant who came in, dropped off essentially a boilerplate CWPP that had no community participation or buy-in or really anything. You know, maybe they talked to a few key planners or something, but essentially they drop off a big plan. It sits on the shelf and no one even knows what's in it. It's not very good. When you open it up, you're like, wait a minute, this doesn't even make sense for this particular county. So those plans on one hand are a waste of money, to be frank, and they can be quite expensive. On the other hand, plans, and it can be an outside consultant again, but more often it has a local kind of, again, a catalyst or a coordinator who's really driving the planning development. And those that engage the community through those long meetings that everybody sort of dislikes, they're really important because that's how you get some buy-in and raise awareness of issues that might not come up otherwise, like particular connecting roads. Oh, that's really difficult to travel in the rain. That's not going to work as an evacuation route or something. You might not realize that from the planning department perspective, but the people who live on the road know. And so there are all sorts of little details like that that are really crucial. And of course, if the community doesn't buy into it, it's not going to get used. So one of the things we noticed is when we looked at these different CWPPs and we looked at what had happened on the ground between when it was written and when we evaluated it, we saw that those CWPPs that had a real clear prioritization were much more effective at getting things done. So those CWPPs that had some sort of list or a map or some way to prioritize projects, and the more specific the projects, the better, then managers, community members were able to kind of take that list and say, okay, let's get these done. We know what we need to do. Let's go out and do it. And I saw cases where managers, whether it was county fire or Forest Service or whoever, would have a piece essentially torn from the CWPP or printed out from the CWPP with that map or that list that they would sort of check off and say, oh yeah, we got the corner of Main Street and Route 5. That little area was dealt with. We can check that off the list. Oh, there's some grant funding available for a youth crew. That'll give us a chance to take care of clearing brush in this area. That was another priority on our CWPP. That's how these projects got done. And in contrast, CWPPs that used a lot of hand waving and said things like, oh, well, we want to reduce risk in general, that's much harder to go out and do or to keep track of. So we noticed, and this kind of ties back to some of our modeling work of the fuel treatments on the ground, that the pace and scale of fuel reduction treatments does not appear to be fast enough or to cover enough area to keep fire from communities. So a lot of good work is happening out there, but it's not happening on enough acres or fast enough to actually ensure that fire is not going to enter these communities. So we're still going to have to accept that fire is a part of fire-adapted ecosystems, essentially. We can step up the pace, we can step up the scale, but that takes a lot of resources. So going back to some of that modeling work, we may still have surface fires coming into town, which kind of emphasizes the importance of the home mitigation. One of the biggest challenges we saw looking at all these CWPPs and talking to the individuals engaged in them was the idea of maintenance. So this idea that you can go in, you can treat an area, but you're going to have to go back in and retreat it. The leaves fall and then you're building up your surface fuels again. New seedlings grow in, the invasive species come back. So it's a constant process. And unfortunately, the dollars and the energy to go back and treat an area that's already been treated are probably harder to come by than the first time through. So and this I think is both true in the woods as well as around somebody's home. Maybe the first time someone goes in to clear around their home, they have a lot of energy to do it, but a year later when they realize, gee, I got to go back out and do that, maybe the enthusiasm isn't there as much. So that's something to be aware of. How do we build systems, wildfire prevention strategies that ensure some kind of continuation, some kind of maintenance? The last point is actually something that we've added in since most of our work wrapped up. It's not highlighted in the report as much as it would be if I were to rewrite it today, and that's this idea of planning for after fire. So, and I put up a little news blurb that I saw just yesterday, I think, about the Fort McMurray fire in Canada. So that was 6 months ago, and they're really struggling with this long road to recovery. And that's unavoidable. There's going to be recovery from a major disaster like a wildfire in a community. But there are things we can do in advance to plan for and strategize about that mean our recovery is faster. And there are some communities that we looked at in New Mexico where, for example, water systems were threatened. But because they had done some planning up front, they had the funds available to get matching grants to do the immediate sort of emergency stabilization that needed to happen. And so having some awareness that that's a need, having the matching funds available is crucial in that case. And it may be planning for communication post-wildfire, or how some of the less fortunate in the community are going to be cared for. All these sorts of things are really crucial to ensuring that the process of recovery is as quick as possible. So I wanted to turn, I know I'm running short of time, but in just a couple of minutes I wanted to turn to some examples that I looked at briefly, and I know there are probably people on the line who know a lot more about these locations than I do, but I thought they were a good opportunity to make some links between our examples in New Mexico and what might be true in a Western context, and what the similarities and difference were in the Northeast. So one is Barnegat Township in New Jersey, and so they've had a lot of wildfire experience recently, but they also had Hurricane Sandy in 2012, and so this highlighted for me one of the differences that we might see in a North Atlantic context, and that is that fire is one of a number of major threats. Obviously, we have other threats in the West. There are floods and hailstorms and all sorts of things, but I think that the relative proportion of threat from different kind of natural disasters is different in the Northeast, and maybe highlights this need to integrate community wildfire protection planning with all hazard planning. And a lot of communities, counties, cities are doing all hazard plans. That's a relatively recent development where emergency management offices are creating these all hazard plans to access funding. And so I think this is true across the country, but it maybe is most true in the Northeast, where the wildfire planning needs to be part of that all hazard planning. And we certainly advocate anywhere that wildfire planning and all hazard planning kind of are linked, but I think that link probably needs to be tighter in northeastern communities. Looking at the Barnegat Township example, it struck me that people were still the key. There's a lot of discussion of the Horizons community. I believe it's a senior citizen retirement community, and it seemed like they were really drivers of a wave of wildfire prevention and really kind of models for other places within the community that wanted to achieve that goal. So again, it seemed like particular individuals, particular communities were really crucial to making a wider area more fire safe or adapted. The other CWPP I took a brief look at was the Barnstable County Wildfire Protection Plan or Preparedness Plan for in Massachusetts, Cape Cod. And one of the things I wanted to pull out of this example that is actually very similar to CWPPs in New Mexico and from what I know of the rest of the country, and that is this balance between sort of the larger county-wide scale with more detailed areas. So Barnstable did a really nice job of treating the whole county because it is a county-wide plan and a lot of the response and structures are built on county sort of administration. But in order to have priorities, I don't know if you can see in this map, but these different areas are labeled with numbers 2 or 3 down here below. So in order to prioritize treatments, they really had to drill down to the township level detail. And they did an excellent job in sort of combining those two scales of thinking in one plan. And that I think is something that other CWPPs should really think about how to replicate. It may be that you're not working at a county level CWPP, but you still probably have multiple scales that you're considering, and there are different ways to handle it that we talk a little bit about in the guide, but it can be that you have one plan that's kind of overarching, and then you have subsidiary CWPPs that tackle different communities or towns, or the Barnstable County model is a good one too, where they're all together in one document. So I'm going to wrap up here and hopefully leave some time for discussions and questions, but I wanted to wrap up with this other idea around fire-adapted communities. So I've been focusing on CWPPs and FireWise, fuel reduction, but in fact these of course are just elements in a wider view. Things like evacuation routes that can be part of CWPPs, but as I was talking about, they can be engaged with all hazards plans, or Ready, Set, Go, the idea that the program to have people thinking about what do I need to take when I need to evacuate. Codes and ordinances, we talked a little bit about this in the guide, although I didn't mention it today. These are really crucial for the long-term development of fire-adapted communities. So there are all these elements that, when taken together, can make a community ready to accept the risk for the natural area they live in. So for me, I live in Santa Fe. I live in a fire-adapted ecosystem. The trees, the plants, the animals, they're all adapted to having fire. And so I need my community and I need to be adapted to fire as well. And that's the idea behind fire-adapted communities. It's not saying we'll never have fire, we'll never have smoke from wildfire or prescribed fire in town. It's saying, yeah, those things are going to happen, so how do we adapt to that? And the other slide, the previous slide, looks nicer with the straight arrows, but I always add these circular arrows to try to get across the idea that these are all iterative processes. You have to go back and look again at your codes and ordinances. Maybe you did FireWise once, but now it's a couple of years later. You have to go back and look, well, has the science changed? Do I need to adjust what I'm doing around my home? Do we need to rethink the CWPP? Most of those CWPPs get rewritten or revised every 5 years. So it's not you get a medal that says, oh, you're fire adapted, you're all done. It's a continuing process. And even things like, for many of us, as the climate warms, and at least for me, it's drying. Northeast, maybe it's getting wetter. But as our environment changes, our thinking about some of these things is going to change too. So that's my pitch for continually moving towards becoming fire-adapted communities. And I think CWPPs can be a great tool for taking those steps. So I think with that, I've covered the sort of main points of what I wanted to cover, but I'd love to hear some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Zander. That was really excellent. We've had a few questions that have come into the chat box, and again, for folks that are in the webinar, feel free to type some more questions in as we go, and at the end, we might have time to open up the phone lines to catch some folks that might not be in mic help. So the first question that we had that came in was from Susan Buckley. She says, in the interest of gaining compliance, are these assessments shared with insurance companies or other programs that help encourage homeowners to comply?
That is an excellent question. So you've really kind of driven to the heart of one of the key issues with home assessments. Because when you do home assessments, the first thing people say is, okay, how is this going to affect my insurance? And that it's handled differently in different places. So some counties actually put the data up online, and so you can see what your neighbor's score was. Well, gee, I got a sort of a green score, a good score, but my neighbor's property is listed as red, and I know that fires can transfer from home to home as easily as it can from tree to tree. So I'm now going to talk to my neighbor about, hey, gee, do you need help clearing that, or how can I reduce the risk? So that's one strategy, is just make it public. There are some issues with working with insurance companies because you can affect property values, and so there is a sort of there's some legal wrangling that can happen. And that's, I think, one reason to just go with the making it public route. But, for example, some insurance companies do their own assessments. And so, and I've heard cases where those assessors are well-trained and know what's going on. And in other cases, they're just totally disconnected from reality. And, for example, there was one county in New Mexico where it's super dry. There's not enough water to go around, and they were like, well, where are your sprinklers? And everyone said, sprinklers? What are you talking about? No one has sprinklers. Like, that's just not feasible here. So sometimes that work with insurance company can be a partnership where you sort of highlight, hey, these are the range of risks, and here's how a credible agency like an emergency management department or a fire department assesses the risk. But within insurance companies, there's also an issue of collusion. So the two insurance companies, unless it's public information, there's two insurance companies can't use, say, the same assessor, because then it could be sort of price fixing with insurance companies. So I don't think I gave a totally clear answer to your question, but I just wanted to highlight that there are a lot of nuances to the interaction between home assessments and insurance. And you should, before you embark on a home assessment program, you should check in with the appropriate legal advice to make sure that no one's going to get sued about it, that you're within your sort of purview. There's also some legal issues about access. And that was one of the problems I mentioned. There were some differences between a first assessment and a second assessment. Sometimes that's because somebody didn't have access. And what in our case, we didn't go through locked gates. We only went in when invited, partially for our own safety, but also that's there's trespassing issues. So using publicly available information like air photos or something to do a standardized assessment might be a way to minimize some of those other concerns. If I did a poor job of answering a question, we can follow up. You can drop me an email and we can talk more. But hopefully, I kind of pulled out some of the key thoughts on insurance and home assessments.
Great, thank you, Zander. That's definitely a tough one. The next question we had was, are there grants or funding, state, federal, available for people who would like to make the more expensive changes, like a metal roof to replace a shaker?
Another good question. So I don't know of any federal sort of national programs. There are often programs to do some of the thinning work, and that's sort of, I just happen to know about that because I'm a forester, so that's the stuff I know about. I think there are a few programs for home improvements, but those may be state-related. I'm thinking of California, I think, has some programs. And that might be another one where if you can connect with insurance companies and make a case that you're significantly reducing your risk by making that change, that might be another benefit, or sort of monetary offset. Say, look, I made this change, so can you drop my rates a little bit? And that is happening a little bit. There's some programs with USAA, their insurance arm, and they were doing some work around wildfire risk reduction in, I think, Washington. So that's happening a little bit out there, but I can't point you to any particular, like, oh, here's where you go to get, to pay for your roof redone. I think that there are a few programs out there, but I think for something like a roof, it's pretty far and few between, and it's likely to be state or local.
Great, thank you. So we had another question that came in. We heard this week on a field trip in New Jersey that although a CWPP had been created, there was little to no enthusiasm for implementation in local municipalities. What types of outreach do you recommend to get buy-in after a CWPP has already been created?
So that's a great question, Inga. I would say, in some ways, I love that question because it just reinforces one of the points I was trying to make, that where you have an inclusive planning process, the CWPP is more likely to get used. And it's kind of just the reverse of the question you're asking. But, okay, the CWPP is out there. There's no turning back the clock and starting again. I would say that in some respects you do have to go back to square one with the outreach. That you have to say to directly connect with those people who might have felt left out or might feel that the CWPP doesn't acknowledge their issues or whatever the problem is, acknowledge that problem and go back and say, look, we understand that either the words on paper or the process to get those words on paper didn't do you right, but we still want to make this community more fire adapted. How can we build in your concerns in the future, in a revision someday down the line, and in the interim, maybe their priorities aren't on the priority list. Well, you can add those in. You can say, look, we did the CWPP, we have this priority list, and we have an addendum that has other priorities, or whatever the case may be. You have to go, you got to talk to those people. You got to, in some cases, you got to hear them yell at you. And that's never fun, but it can be a crucial element to bringing them back on board. And I think there's just no shortcut to that public participation piece. And often when I say public participation, people picture, local homeowners sitting around, but that can just as well be agencies, mayors or select people or something like that. They're the public just as much as anybody else, and if they feel left out, the cut can be doubly deep because they feel like, hey, I have an important role here. How come you're leaving me out? So I guess the bottom line I would say is just go back to square one and try to build in that public participation as best you can. We actually just were working with Los Alamos County, or city really, because they had developed a plan and they hadn't involved the public, and our state forestry agency that signs off on all CWPPs said, no, we're not going to sign off on this. You didn't talk to anybody. And so even though the plan was essentially written, we went back and held public meetings and talked to people, explained things, and there were a few adjustments, but it was really about that communication piece more than anything.
Great, thank you. We have another question related to communication and also to fuel modeling. So Kent Nelson from Maine is curious where the data for the fuel modeling originated, and he'd also like to know how the fuel modeling treatments were communicated to the homeowners and stakeholders. He's wondering, was it good enough just to tell them how it worked, or did they need to see them on a computer?
Yeah, so those are nicely related questions, and I'll just sort of address them as a bundle. So in this project, we didn't, and maybe we should have done more of this, but we didn't go back to specific communities and say, hey, here were the results from the modeling around your community. Because it was a little bit more of like a meta analysis across all these communities to say what's the overall impact of these fuel treatments. Certainly it's out there and available for them, and we've done other webinars and things like that to share it, and we've been to our state WUI summit to share this information, but we didn't go back to, say, the fuel planner outside of Ruidoso to say, hey, look, here's what we found. So that's probably a failing on our part. I will say, though, in a slightly different context, where we have done more specific modeling for CWPPs or for some sort of planning, it is really crucial that people, even if their eyes start to glaze over, that you give them a chance to see where the data for some modeling goes in, because models are always wrong. They're always some simplification of the real world, and so they're never going to be exactly what happens. So we have to acknowledge that and kind of talk through that as we try to use them. And this sort of modeling can be very useful for developing CWPPs and developing priorities for where do we want to do treatment. Well, we want to do treatment that reduces the high severity wildfire, so we want to know where to go. We have limited dollars, we want to hit the top spots. So this kind of modeling can be useful. And to that end, I'll say that we did, I didn't actually do the modeling, thank goodness, but our modeler, Laura, she used some fairly standard, publicly accessible modeling tools. They're not easy to use. It was Flam Map, and if you sat down to try to use it, it would take some learning, but it is publicly available, and the data, much of it was land fire data. So for the vegetation, we used land fire. Similarly, topography, et cetera, is built into land fire, and so that's accessible publicly for the whole country, which is a nice reason to use it. Then the treatment data, which was a crucial element to our project, obviously, we had to laboriously collect it from local land managers. Say, hey, can you get us a GIS file of where you put those treatments in? And that's why we worked in the communities we worked in, because those were the areas for which, for some other reason, we had the data already, or we had, they returned our phone calls. So that's often the limitation for doing this kind of work effectively, is that finding out what exactly happened on the ground and where it happened can be tough. So hopefully that answered your question a little bit, Kent, and again, I'm happy to talk in a little more detail. Some of the modeling step-by-step stuff is in the report as well.
All right, great, thank you. So we have another minute for questions if anybody wants to enter another question into the chat box. Also, Zander said that he's willing to stay after the hour if anybody would like to stay on chat, or we could open up the phone lines at that point for anybody who would like to stay on after 1 o'clock. So I'll give folks another 10 seconds or so to try to type in a question into the chat box, and we'll see if we can get a response out quickly too.
Well, and one thing I'll add in closing while somebody's formulating their question is that I feel like CWPPs are a great tool, and somebody asked earlier about grant funding for making changes to homes, home mitigation. There's also grant funding for creating CWPPs, and usually it's a match kind of thing where I believe in New Jersey there's sort of there's $5,000 a match that's available, or was at one point, from the state for communities to write these plans if they can come up with some money on the side. And I will say that the Forest Stewards Guild, because we're so interested in building fire-adapted communities because of its link to good forest management, if there are folks on the line working in communities who are thinking, gee, I'd love to see this happen in my community, it's a little bit daunting, there may be opportunities to partner. And I think that I've been harping on this idea of building people into the process from the beginning. The Forest Stewards Guild might be one of those partners that can help bring folks to the table and advance the conversation. So if there are folks out there interested in this kind of stuff, do get in touch, because I think we're not consultants. We're not into just going around the country to write plans, but I think the opportunity to try to push the envelope and make new, better plans that serve as a model for other communities is something we are interested in.
Great, thank you. It seems that no other questions have come into the chat box for the time being. One postscript I'll add is that a couple of the photos that might have looked like they belong to Inga might have been taken by Joel Carlson. So thank you, Joel, and thanks, Inga, for putting them on our Flickr page. So for everybody who's still online, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to open up the phone lines. You're welcome to cut out, but you're also welcome to pose questions over the phone line to Zander. So thanks everybody for joining us, and stick around if you'd like it, if you have time for the conversation, opening the phone lines. And thank you again, Zander.
Yeah,
so
thanks for having me, Amanda.
Yeah, phone line should be open now.
And one of those days I got to finish up landscaping.
So if anybody has questions.
Saturday I'll probably be working around the yard.
Yep, that's why we kept the phone lines muted earlier.
I'll be a family day, watch the football game.
Well, maybe we should let everyone go.
Saturday we could both.
Okay. All right. We can do that.
Yeah, we can do that.
So I'll mute the phone lines again.
Thank you.
Okay, so phone lines are muted. We'll let everybody go. But again, if you have questions, Zander's happy to answer them. So feel free to send him an email or give him a phone call. I might try unmuting again in a second just in case, but thanks everybody for joining us.
Excellent.
Thanks, Amanda. Should I close out the webinar?
Let's see. Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea. Okay.
Okay, thanks
everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Zander. Okay.